Hey everyone, Brandon here from Trucksafe. In 2021, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and its state partners conducted a total of 7,989 federal compliance reviews, or safety audits as they're sometimes called. 175 of those resulted in the carrier receiving an unsatisfactory safety rating, and a whopping 1,061 resulted in a conditional rating. Now, unsatisfactory and conditional ratings can take substantial tolls on a carrier's business. So how can carriers get those ratings upgraded once they've been assigned? That's the question we're answering in this video. So stay tuned and do us a favor, hit that like and subscribe button below if you find this type of content helpful. D.O.T. safety ratings, also known as safety fitness determinations, are reflections of a motor carrier's compliance with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations as of the date of the FMCSA audit that resulted in that rating. There are three available ratings: satisfactory, conditional, and unsatisfactory. If an audit reveals substantial enough non-compliance, the carrier can be shut down entirely. And aside from the regulatory consequences, safety ratings can also have commercial consequences, given that they are publicly available through the FMCSA's online SAFER database. Now, before diving into exactly how motor carriers can work to upgrade their safety rating, let's first explore the consequences of a less than satisfactory rating. First up, unsatisfactory ratings lead to operational out-of-service orders. Section 385.13 of the Federal Safety Regulations provides that a carrier who receives an unsatisfactory rating following a compliance review is prohibited from operating a commercial motor vehicle in both interstate and intrastate commerce, meaning that the carrier's entire fleet will be shut down once the unsatisfactory rating becomes final. In practice, we've seen local law enforcement dispatched to locations of an unsatisfactory rated carrier to physically remove the license plates from vehicles once the rating takes effect. Further, if the carrier is a for-hire rather than private motor carrier, its operating authority will be automatically revoked as a result of the unsatisfactory rating. Next up, conditional ratings can lead to increased insurance premiums. Now, while conditional safety ratings don't result in operational out-of-service orders, they are often accompanied by civil penalties. And aside from those regulatory consequences, conditional ratings tend to lead to increased premiums on the carrier's commercial auto liability insurance coverage. The idea being that from an underwriting perspective, the carrier has been deemed less safe and more risky than if it had received a satisfactory rating or no rating at all. That premium increase can be significant, and in practice, we've worked with a number of motor carriers who simply could not afford that increased premium after they received a conditional rating. Lastly, unsatisfactory and conditional ratings can tarnish your goodwill and cause you to lose customers. Carriers, particularly those that are for hire, that receive a less than satisfactory rating following an FMCSA audit risk losing business as a result. More and more shippers and property brokers are unwilling to do business with motor carriers that have been assigned a conditional and certainly an unsatisfactory safety rating. Often, any written agreement that's in place between that carrier and its shipper or broker customers will mandate that the carrier maintain a satisfactory rating or no rating at all. Thus, receiving a conditional or unsatisfactory rating can have a long-lasting impact on your customer relationships. So those are the major consequences of a less than satisfactory rating. But how exactly are those ratings assigned? Well, the FMCSA determines a carrier's safety rating in accordance with the detailed safety rating methodology contained in Appendix B to 49 CFR Part 385. As a preliminary matter, the FMCSA only issues safety ratings to carriers that have undergone on or off-site compliance reviews. These audits are conducted by either the FMCSA or one of its state enforcement partners. Motor carriers are prioritized for these audits based in part on their roadside performance relative to their peers through the system known as SMS, or Safety Measurement System. Carriers with relatively high SMS scores in one or more of the 7 measured categories are at an increased risk for an FMCSA audit. Once a carrier is selected for an audit, the investigator evaluates and rates the carrier's compliance in one or more of 6 broad factor areas. First up is general compliance, then we have driver qualification and drug and alcohol testing, and then hours of service, vehicle maintenance, hazardous materials if you haul it, and accidents. Each individual factor rating depends on the number of acute and/or critical violations that the investigator uncovers within those factors. Acute regulations are those identified as such where noncompliance is so severe as to require immediate corrective action by the motor carrier, regardless of the overall safety posture of that carrier. An example is allowing a driver to operate a commercial motor vehicle after he or she has tested positive for drugs or alcohol. Critical regulations, on the other hand, are those identified as such where noncompliance relates to the management or operational controls of that carrier. These are indicative of breakdowns in the carrier's management controls. Whereas a single violation of an acute regulation has the potential to negatively impact a carrier's factor rating, violations of critical regulations require a violation rate of at least 10% of the files checked in order to impact the carrier's rating. As an example, a violation of the 11-hour driving rule. If, for example, an investigator reviews 30 days worth of driver logs for 2 drivers during the audit, a total of 60 logs, and discovers 6 11-hour violations, this would amount to a critical violation, since 10% of the files checked had that same violation. Once the investigator completes the audit, he or she will tally the number of acute and/or critical violations in each of the 6 factors. One acute or critical violation in any of the factors will result in a conditional rating in that factor, except for the hours of service factor, where acute and critical violations are double weighted and thus result in an automatic unsatisfactory factor rating. Now, 2 or more acute or critical violations in any factor will result in an unsatisfactory rating in that factor. Now, once all factors are tallied, the agency uses a chart to determine the carrier's overall proposed safety rating. Importantly, when it comes to upgrading a safety rating, it's important to understand that less than satisfactory ratings are considered proposed as opposed to final for a certain period of time following the compliance review. For general commodity carriers, the rating will remain proposed for a period of 60 days. For hazmat carriers, on the other hand, the rating is proposed for 45 days. Once the applicable time period expires, the rating will become final, assuming the carrier hasn't successfully upgraded that rating in the interim. Carriers that receive a less than satisfactory rating following an audit have a couple of options available to them to try and get that rating upgraded. First up is an administrative appeal using the procedures set forth in 49 CFR 385.15. An administrative appeal is appropriate if the carrier believes the assigned safety rating was premised on legal or factual errors made during that audit. Importantly, the FMCSA has held that an administrative appeal is not appropriate in situations where the legal or factual errors committed would not ultimately change the safety rating if those are corrected. As an example, let's say that your compliance review resulted in you receiving an unsatisfactory rating in the hours of service factor and a conditional rating in the driver and the accident factors, which led to an overall conditional rating. And let's say that the FMCSA made a legal error that led to the conditional rating in the driver factor, but was otherwise correct in its assessment. Now, even if you're correct about the legal error in the driver factor and your rating in that factor were therefore upgraded to satisfactory, you would still be left with an overall conditional rating due to the unsatisfactory rating in the hours of service factor and the conditional rating in the accident factor. Accordingly, an administrative appeal would not be appropriate in this circumstance. If an administrative appeal is appropriate, the carrier needs to file it as soon as possible after the FMCSA issues the proposed rating. If the rating is unsatisfactory, the FMCSA has a regulatory obligation to rule on the carrier's administrative appeal within a certain amount of time after it's submitted. 30 days for hazmat carriers and 45 days for non-hazmat carriers. Thus, if the unsatisfactory rating is still in the proposed stage, it's imperative that the appeal is filed within 15 days after that rating is proposed so that the FMCSA rules on the appeal before that rating becomes final, since filing an appeal doesn't extend that time frame. If, on the other hand, the rating is conditional, the FMCSA is under no regulatory obligation to rule on the appeal within a certain amount of time. So it's entirely possible that even if you were to file the appeal shortly after the conditional rating is proposed, that rating could become final before the FMCSA ever rules on your appeal. In any event, administrative appeals must be filed within 90 days of the date the rating becomes final. Otherwise, your appeal option is deemed waived, and your only option to upgrade is based on corrective actions, which we'll discuss in a minute. Administrative appeals are initiated by filing a formal notice of appeal with the FMCSA's Chief Safety Officer, who is based out of the FMCSA's headquarters in Washington, D.C. The notice must explain in detail the reasons why you believe the rating was assigned in error and attach any documentation information or evidence to support your argument. Once the appeal is filed, the Chief Safety Officer typically requests that the agency respond to your appeal with its own version of the facts and law. And occasionally, the Chief Safety Officer will require the carrier to submit additional evidence or attend a conference to discuss the appeal. Once the case is fully briefed, the Chief Safety Officer will render his or her decision, which is considered a final agency order. If the Chief Safety Officer grants the appeal, then the rating will be rescinded, but if not, the rating will be upheld. As a final agency order, the Chief Safety Officer's decision is appealable to Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal. Okay, so the administrative appeal option was the first option. The second option is an upgrade request premised on the carrier's actions to correct any admitted violations discovered during the audit. This type of upgrade request is outlined in 49 CFR 385.17. Although carriers can file upgrade requests at any time after the issuance of their safety rating, carriers should try to file them as soon as possible after the close of the audit, particularly if the proposed rating is unsatisfactory. As with the administrative appeals, the FMCSA is under a regulatory obligation to review and rule on an unsatisfactory rated carrier's corrective action upgrade request within a certain amount of time after it's filed. Again, 30 days for hazmat carriers and 45 days for non-hazmat carriers. Thus, if your unsatisfactory rating is in the proposed stage, filing the upgrade request within 15 days after the rating is proposed will ensure that you receive a response before that rating becomes final and your fleet is shut down. On the other hand, the FMCSA is under no regulatory obligation to review or rule on a conditionally rated carrier's upgrade request within any certain amount of time. And in our experience, the agency may take several months to rule on that type of request, depending on the complexity of the issues involved and how backed up the service center is. If you have lived with a less than satisfactory rating for quite some time, you should know that the FMCSA may not be inclined to grant your upgrade request without coming back in and conducting another audit. Carriers can initiate a corrective action upgrade request by filing an upgrade petition and safety management plan, or SMP, with the FMCSA's regional field office that oversees the region in which the motor carrier is situated, with a copy to the FMCSA state office in the state in which they are situated. These requests must be based on evidence that the carrier has substantially corrected the violations that led to the downgraded rating. It's crucial that the carrier's SMP detail the steps that the carrier took to first identify the root causes of any such violations and then correct the issues so that the same types of violations do not reoccur in the future. In our experience, the evidence submitted with the request must be substantial and must demonstrate that the corrective actions have been effective at fixing the problems. In other words, bare assertions that the problems have been fixed without any corresponding proof will almost always result in the request being denied. The corrective action upgrade request process sometimes requires some back and forth with the agency. For example, the agency may review the initial request in SMP and decide that it needs additional evidence, in which case it may ask the carrier to provide it. Alternatively, the agency may deny the request outright, but include instructions to the carrier for what steps must be taken and what information must be submitted if the carrier is to submit another request. If the agency does deny the carrier's request, such denial can be appealed through the FMCSA's administrative appeal procedures that we just discussed, if the carrier believes that the agency acted unreasonably in denying that request. Otherwise, the carrier must continue to work on correcting the deficiencies, documenting those corrective actions, and filing another request. Ultimately, if the agency is satisfied with the SMP, then it can upgrade the rating without any conditions. Importantly, in our experience, it's extremely rare for the FMCSA to upgrade an unsatisfactory rating all the way up to satisfactory. Instead, the agency is much more likely to upgrade an unsatisfactory rating to conditional first, and then require the carrier to submit another request in the future after enough time has passed to evaluate the effectiveness of the carrier's corrective actions. Lastly, if your rating stemmed from a so-called focused audit, one that didn't involve a review of all of the factor areas, you should note that it will not be possible to upgrade your rating to anything higher than the rating that you had before the audit. For example, if you were an unrated carrier prior to a focused audit, and that focused audit resulted in you receiving a conditional rating, the best result you can hope for in filing an upgrade request is that you'll be returned to unrated status. In other words, you would not be upgraded to satisfactory based on your corrective actions. All right, that's going to going to wrap things up for this video. A DOT safety rating is one of the most important assets for a motor carrier, and it should be protected at all costs. If you found yourself with a less than satisfactory rating, there are options available to you to upgrade that rating. If you need assistance with or guidance on preparing an upgrade request, feel free to get in touch with us. We regularly assist motor carriers of all types and sizes with these types of requests. For even more in-depth information about these types of regulatory issues and major aspects of the federal and state safety regulations, be sure to check out our innovative online compliance courses for safety managers and drivers over at trucksafeacademy.com. Also, be sure to check out our detailed compliance articles on our website at trucksafe.com and follow us on our various social media pages for the latest highway transportation news and analysis. Thanks for watching.